Hello, and thank you, Apex, for having me here. And this is really a pleasure to be here and be able to talk to you about a process that is so human and so interesting. Creativity is such a fantastic and complex topic, and I always like to start any discussion on creativity with a quote by someone who was very creative. And in this case, we have one from the recent memoir of famed film critic Roger Ebert, and he writes, "When I write, I fall into the zone many writers, painters, musicians, athletes, and craftsmen of all sorts seem to share. In doing something I enjoy and am expert at, deliberate thought falls aside and it is all just there. I think of the next word no more than the composer thinks of the next note." And it's really interesting to read this quote here because he's talking about falling into the zone, about being an expert, and by being an expert, he's able to enter this stage of automatic writing and therefore let consciousness take over. And this actually turns out to be many of the motivations for asking the following questions within the study of creativity, specifically in the neuroscience and the cognitive psychology fields, and also in other disciplines, and which are, what is creativity? Are there different types of creativity? How does creativity evolve through time? So what happens when you go from being a novice at something and becoming an expert in that particular domain? Why are we so creative? Why do we care so much about this process? And finally, the actual question that I'm going to focus on today is, how do we accomplish such a complex cognitive feat? Well, all of these questions are really, really important, and despite the abundance of literature on the subject from such disciplines as philosophy, history of art, anthropology, computer science, and that's really just to name a few, and also the wealth of scientific and other discoveries throughout our history of human evolution, the systematic psychological study of the topic is actually really young science. It wasn't until 1950 when the president of the American Psychological Association, J.P. Guilford, literally said, we need to study creativity. And in fact, this is the beginning of his talk. He said, "I discussed the subject of creativity with considerable hesitation, for it represents an area in which psychologists generally, whether they be angels or not, have feared to tread. It has been one of my long-standing ambitions, however, to undertake an investigation of creativity." And here, I just mentioned the word, I just want to emphasize the word of considerable hesitation. And I think the reason, there's this fear that has resulted from the seeming elusiveness of the act of creativity. However, as a prominent characteristic of human intelligence, which includes to reason, to think, to plan and communicate, creativity is a fundamental activity of human information processing. And just the examples here, self-portrait by Francis Bacon, or even just this image of Miles Davis, one of the jazz greats, riffing away. And then just below there, a fascinating painting by Remedios Varo, a surrealist painter, really goes to show that we can go on and on with examples of human creativity, and really doesn't matter the domain in which we want to pick. And this brings us to what is called the creative cognitive approach that is advocated by the psychological sciences. And that basically states that creativity is far from a magical event. In fact, it has nothing to do with magic, and it has nothing to do with unexpected random inspiration. It's a clear mental occurrence that it results from the application of ordinary cognitive processes. And what I mean by that is that we're integrating bottom-up processing or sensory information with top-down processing, which means knowledge and experience, to produce a novel and evolutionarily valuable outcome. And so, given this approach, this one of the creative cognitive approach, what this means is that classic methods to study, that have been used to study behavior and the mind-brain, can be used. And one such method that's commonly used is what underlies behavioral psychology and makes observations from stimulus and response settings. So here's an example in which creativity is considered a problem-solving task that can be measured in terms of divergent production, keywords there. which basically means quantifying varied outcomes in response to test items, irrespective of usefulness. And this was actually advocated by J.P. Guilford himself, who started with a lot of interesting experiments. And so what the example here is that all of these, basically what they do is they give subjects, when they're testing them, they give subjects these different objects, these different designs, and they say, make whatever you want. And what's fascinating is that participants end up, these are examples of what participants made with those objects. And what's fascinating is that we tend to make familiar or very different objects irrespective of the evolutionary outcome of it. So these are objects that have nothing to do with, that are going to help us survive, yet we make them. And so this brings up the idea in terms of, we are being creative, and what does this mean if it has nothing to do with helping us survive? In this particular example, of course. And so from these studies that were done, 4 different creative processes were clearly identified. And they're actually the ones that dominate most experimental settings on the topic. One such example is called deliberate cognitive process, which basically refers to inventiveness that arises from sustained work in a discipline on a particular problem. So just the classic example, Watson and Crick are working hours on end and years to finally discover the double helix. Another process is known as the deliberate emotional, and that basically is the experience of the aha moment that's typically associated with a positive emotion. So I don't know if you remember looking through those Where's Waldo books, where you're looking for the little man, and then suddenly like, aha, literally, aha. So that's why it's called the aha approach. And it's something that's positive. The third approach is known as the spontaneous cognitive, and that's what's known in folk terms as the eureka moment, which basically occurs suddenly when the problem-solving context has been left. So the classic example here is that Newton is sitting under the tree, the apple falls on his head, but because he was already thinking about gravity, boom, the idea came to him. And then finally, but not least, is the spontaneous emotional process, which basically refers to an intense emotional experience, creates the strong need for creative invention. And just a classic example is Rodrigo's Concierto de Aranjuez for guitar. What happened, this composer, upon the death of his unborn child, he wrote this piece as a way to release from the emotional pain. So this is purely guided by emotional reasons. And the second methodology that's used is that of the neurosciences, of course. And here in the neurosciences, the primary goal is to identify relationships between structure or anatomy with function or behavior. And the idea that localized areas have specific functions has been around actually since the late 1700s, when phrenology became really popular in trying to understand personality traits and from various curves and bumps observable by touching one's scalp. And by now, and due to much better methodologies and techniques within the neurosciences, we safely know that the brain is divided into particular parts, and the occipital lobe is for visual processes, parietal lobe is for motor, somatosensory processes, the temporal lobe is for auditory processes, and basically these 3 lobes are devoted to perception and long-term memory. Furthermore, we know that the frontal cortex is what makes us really so human, is that it's the seat of executive functioning. And basically that means it allows us to plan, to make decisions, form judgments, assess risk, formulate insight, and basically be creative. And of course, using what we know, we can definitely also start to ask, what are the neural correlates of the of any of these 4 creative processing modes we were just discussing. And those are currently being in experimental activity. And here's just a diagram of those different lobes in the brain. And I just want to point out here in the frontal area, we know furthermore that the VMPFC, so the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, is connected to the amygdala and cingulate cortex in the limbic system. And basically what that means is that it's implicated in emotional processing, that particular area. And then furthermore, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is what is receiving input from occipital, parietal, and temporal lobes, so from all of these sensory areas. and it basically helps to send direct output to motor cortices. So for example, if you see some information, so that you go towards that object. And while a lot was figured out from post-mortem studies in the early days of brain research, today, of course, we have amazing brain imaging techniques that are advantageous for us now because they're non-invasive. And we can literally look at activity or problems within the human brain in real time. And those techniques are available are fMRI, CT, PET, EEG, and MEG type of techniques. But I just want to highlight right now the fMRI, or functional magnetic resonance imaging. And the reason why I'm highlighting it is because most studies, particularly in creativity, and most cognitive neurobehavioral psychological studies are using this. And the way it works is that it detects changes in blood oxygenation and flow in response to neural activity. So basically, when the brain area is more active, it consumes more oxygen, and so blood flow increases to that particular area, and so we can actually detect those changes with this technique. And yet another methodology that's in the business of dissecting apart the cognitive process is that of computational modeling, which basically it relies on the following premise. If necessary conditions for human intellectual capacity are the abilities to interact with the environment, to learn and to self-organize, then any human-like artificial creative system must do the same. So the way that works in very simplified terms is, in order to model this, is that you formulate an algorithm of how human creative behaviors operate, then you construct a computer system with the human capacity to create, and then you finally design programs to hopefully in the future enhance human innovation so that we're working together with computers in conjunction with our ability to be creative. And one of the earlier models of computational creative design treats insight as a moving problem space process, which, as we can see here in this diagram, is a type of search, really, that evolves over time as new variables and questions enter the search space until you finally come up with a novel design. So in other words, you have a problem, you have an issue at hand is where you start with, and as you go about and receive input and feedback as you try to solve that problem, you start moving into new spaces, and so that's all it means, that you're constantly back and forth between spaces until you reach your final goal. And last but not least, and maybe the oldest really of all methodologies, is what's now called arts-based cognitive research. But basically what it is that it just refers to the cognitive exploration through the actual process of art making in any medium. And I put this wonderful quote by Pablo Picasso, because he says, "I never made a painting as a work of art, it's all research." So really for him, art really is all about exploration, it's about asking questions. And also, I just also put this little image here, which is a still from Clouseau's 1956 movie, Le Mystère Picasso, because what's fascinating about this documentary, if you're not familiar with it, is that he actually asked Picasso to make a bunch of different paintings such that he could document exactly the creative process. After the movie was done, they destroyed everything. So I think except for a few of the paintings that Picasso did, they do not exist. And the reason why is because the movie is all about the process, the creative process, not the outcome. And so they had to destroy everything, because then it's no longer, the product is not important, which is an interesting way of looking at this type of methodology. And so, once again, the formal definition is that it's the systematic use of the artistic process as the primary way to explore, experiment with, and understand perception, emotion, memory, consciousness, and other such human activities. And basically what this means is that this interesting approach, it's interesting because it's merging the controlled experimental sort of push and pull of variables within the scientific method, but it's also incorporating the unbounded exploration of the artistic process. Okay, so let's see some data. So with this background in mind, now we're going to delve a little into some research I've been an integral part of in my quest to understand, what's happening during the creative process. And this brings us to one of the widely used creative modes for testing within cognitive neuroscience, and that's basically improvisation, or the spontaneous creative mode. And the definition basically of improvisation is a dynamic moment where immediate decision-making occurs as new ideas are conceived of and then integrated into an ever-evolving artistic output. So again, it's the idea that in the moment you're problem solving and moving in different spaces. And the very super jargony definition within the field is the spontaneous generation, selection, and execution of novel visual, auditory, motor sequences. And so I've been working in music, and a lot of research has been started to look into music, and so you may be asking, why look at musical improvisation as opposed to design improvisation or other types of art forms? And it's simply just that it's easy to use in an fMRI machine. And as with language, expert musicians can generate a potentially infinite number of contextually meaningful musical phrases by combining a finite set of notes and rhythms. And the point here is that we can actually test these mini creations in an experimental environment. And it turns out that within these studies of musical improvisation, despite the fact that fMRI techniques really came into vogue around the 90s, there really hasn't been much done. So it's still an area for a lot of exploration. And the types of studies that have been done can be divided into three categories. One is trying to understand the creation of new material. What we mean by that is that we test professional musicians generating in the moment novel melodies. So we literally, what happens in these experiments is that we literally put musicians lying down in the fMRI tube. So they're literally supine, looking up, and they have a non-ferromagnetic keyboard, a mini keyboard of about 3 octaves, and usually only using one hand. So you can already imagine it's a little artificial. But at least it can allow us to look at some in-the-moment creation. And there's about 6 studies that have been done in that. Another type of category that exists is the perception of new material. And by that, I'm saying, is novel material actually perceived by a listener or simply assumed? So what that means is that, take, for example, you go to a jazz gig. Everybody assumes that they're improvising because it's socially accepted that the jazz musician, that's what they do. But are you aware of the fact that they're improvising? How do you know they're not just repeating what they always play? So there's been one study that has looked at perceivers' perception of improvisation. And the third category that exists is communication of new material. And by that I mean investigating the intuition that a musical conversation occurs in real time among several professional musicians playing together. So this is sort of the fundamentals of group creativity. We know certainly that when we're in a conversation, we're back and forth. So the question, there's the intuition that music is also, when musicians are playing together, that they're also conversing. So the question becomes, is brain activation during the conversation of musicians the same as brain activation in a normal natural language conversation? And there's only been one study, and that's actually one of the studies that I was involved with, and I'll show you in a little bit. So general results from all of this, you're probably asking, is 2 things. There's basically increased sensory motor and linguistic cortical activity. What this means is that motor cortex area is activated and language areas are activated. Okay, that makes sense. They're doing a highly intricate motor exercise by the fact that they're playing the keyboard, and also they're engaged in music. It's a symbolic language, just like language, a spoken language, natural language. And then the other observation that has been made is that there's a decreased activity in prefrontal cortex. And remember, prefrontal cortex is essential for our ability to plan and make decisions and so forth. So it's been hypothesized that because there's attenuation of the frontal part of the cortex, then maybe in order to create, you have to enter into this zone. Earlier Roger Ebert was talking about the creative process. And so keeping this in mind, I just finished my postdoctoral fellowship at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine over in Baltimore, Maryland. I worked on several studies that fall between 2 of these categories, the one of creation of new material and the communication of new material. And I'll just walk through them really quickly. One of them is that we looked at freestyle rappers. So we basically had rappers come into the hospital, into the fMRI machine, they lied down, and what we're doing is that we're comparing the activation that occurs when they recite a memorized rap versus the activation that occurs when they improv in the moment, they rap, they freestyle in the moment. And just to read you here, so for example, in the memorized part of the rap, it was thump of the beat in a known repeat, rhythm and rhyme make me complete, the climb is sublime when I'm on the mic, spitting lines, they hit you like a lightning strike, was the already memorized rap. And then when they got the cue no, examples were high-priced nerds, nerds in a box, nerds give me eye candy, can't stand me, never really liked to cry at the movie Bambi, it makes you a soul sucker. So they were really creative. The point being is that they are being creative. They are in the moment. And just brain-wise, and the color scheme is desaturated, so this yellow is more of an orangey red color, and that means activation in these brain maps. So again, there's plenty of activation in the motor cortices. And just this slight interesting data, which should be blue, to reflect deactivation. Again, it looks like entering to the zone, so that occurred when they're improving. So again, it looks like you have to enter the zone even when you're freestyling. Another study that we did, which this was the first in communication between individuals, between musicians, we took the classic paradigm of trading fours. What is trading fours? So when jazz musicians, one form of communication they engage with is back and forth between certain bars, and they split and exchange their melodies. And what is the main findings here, and again, this should be more of a red to show activation. There's activation basically in the language areas. So again, they're communicating, and so this reveals that language areas are activated in the brain, and so we can hypothesize that language areas in the brain are not specific for language, but are actually more domain general for communication. Makes sense. Music is communicative, and it's a symbolic language, just like natural language. And then just another recent study that we're currently analyzing is one, again, on jazz improvisation. So musicians, again, are entering into the fMRI machine and improvising small melodies. And just briefly, again, we can see that, so this part should be red, yellow to show activation, which is the language areas. And then we have full-blown deactivation. This should be more of a blue color to show deactivation. We have in the frontal lobe area. So again, improvising really shows that we're entering into this zone. We have to attenuate. We have to get rid of, we have to sort of turn off consciousness. All right, so I don't know, maybe you're wondering, is that it? Isn't the creative process, I started off with saying that, isn't it guided by a host of variables like knowledge, previous experiences, emotion, and so forth? And how is all of this working together? Well, yes, to be creative, we have to think outside of the box. And given the concerns and the urgent need for more inventive methods of study, many questions actually have arisen within this field of study and are at the center of debates as to whether experimental observations really reveal something about the creative process. So, are we really studying this creative artistic process? Is it enough to take a part of the creative act, simplify it, and control it in an artificial setting? Is this simplified exploration generalizable? Can we actually say that, I was just talking about music, does this work for other artistic domains? And okay, so we've identified some brain areas implicated in the process. So now what? And I'm just putting a little quote here. So isn't entering the zone or the pure state of creation when there's an absence of any control exercised by reason exempt from any aesthetic or moral concern? Breton basically, in his Surrealist Manifesto in 1924, said, okay, yeah, in order to enter into automaticity or automatic writing, to enter into the zone, we have to turn off awareness. He already said that, 1924. So today, what we're showing, though, what we can say is fascinating, is that because of technology, we can actually see within the brain non-invasively, and turns out that somebody from the arts and art history had a really interesting hypothesis, and maybe we have now supporting evidence to his hypothesis. So he was on the right track, perhaps. So yeah, these are all valid questions, and while neuroscience can answer some, as you saw, it can't answer all of them alone, and I just want to highlight the word alone. And so perhaps the complete answer lies in returning to the arts and combining all the findings. And when we return to art making, what do we get? Well, at least we get ecological validity. At least we get unexpected spontaneity. We get complexity at its fullest. And maybe we just get the downright unknown. The amazing thing about art is that we feel and we know we're unbound. While in these very rigorous scientific studies, we're constantly controlling our variables and narrowing down and simplifying the experience, behavior, and so forth. And what I'm interested in is not so much the creative process per se from the beginning question to the final outcome, but how the process interacts with emotional, musical, and linguistic behavior in real time, and how each of these elements change as the problem-solving spaces change during live performance. And so I've sort of now returned to the art-making process, as I myself am a trained photographer and filmmaker and have moved into theater now. And so this brings me, I'm just going to go through some examples of what I've done artistically. So this brings me to my work as photographer, and it's a recent body of work that I've been working on in black and white film. And I've been exploring the effects of unexpected lit environments and reflective surfaces on the consequent interpretation of emotion from the viewer's perspective. So I didn't plan these scenes. I call it improvisation because I knew I had my model and I knew what I wanted, but I didn't know how I wanted to do it. And so I realized when I was looking for different environments that I was looking specifically for reflective surfaces or playing with light. And so just here, it's really fascinating that the model here, her face seems almost ominous, but in the reflective surface, because of the angle, it looks different, it looks calm, it looks almost friendly in a way, or maybe sad. So again, totally unexpected, and I didn't realize this really until after I had printed and developed the negatives. Same thing here, you can see from there, again, the facial expression, even though it's the same face, still looks different across different lighting surfaces. Same deal here with stark contrast of light and dark splits that the image contains. And it's interesting also that, this almost seems, once again, a bit ominous, and here, this completely seems to change the effect. So just cutting the image in half with light already creates an emotional disparity, almost a visual dissonance, as we would call it. Furthermore, in this image, the light, dark, again, you don't know what to do emotionally, what is happening. And I've also been playing with visual illusions precisely to create visual dissonance and emotional dissonance. And so here, again, most people ask me, how did I even take this image? I literally just put a mirror and I played with that surface. And likewise here, amazing how the line of the couch seems to split the image and change and make you wonder about what's happening emotionally, especially when her face, I don't know, she looks distraught, but her body's not. So again, this is something that's happening in the process. Again, I didn't know that that was how it was going to turn out. I'm simply playing with what I have in the moment. Same issue here. The shadows seem to divide the image as well. And so my point here is that in all of this, as with any search for meaning within a scene, physical, spatial context, in this case in photography, like chiaroscuro effects or angle changes, facial expressions and body language, it's all, interacting and working together to guide us, then the viewer, to an interpretation. Another question I've been asking now as a filmmaker is, so what if we add music to the mix? Of course, the use of music in film is practically as long as film's history. I mean, I don't know if you know, but music was initially used during the projection of films to actually cover the sound of the projector. It turned out, with that in not too long time, that music actually gave emphatic narrative presence and drama to the visual images that were being showed. And so actually there's entire handbooks of music that were created about, depending on which emotion you want, you can do a certain set of musical harmonies. And so they were being passed and back and forth in all types of movie projections. And in fact, music used to be improvised live. That was the common movie viewing experience. And so I'm just going to show you two examples. What I did is I did this really short 2.5-minute movie where I made the movie, and then I took two sets of different musicians and I said to them, improv the score to me. I want to see what you're thinking, what happens. So here's one example. Okay, so that was one musician. He hadn't seen the movie. I simply said, he's a saxophonist, and I said, just improv the first section before I later then put bell ringing. So you just saw that. Now watch the same movie with 3 musicians who also had not seen the movie, and I said, just go with it. So just really different, right? Completely different emotional effect. And there's actually quite a lot of interesting methods to analyze this. So to make a long story short, what I'm doing is I've actually taken methods from film theory, which is of scene analysis, and I'm combining that with methods within musical analysis in cognitive psychology. And I've actually gone through each scene almost minute, second by second, along with the music. And what's fascinating to see is that literally the musicians are translating in real time what the emotional content and as well as trying to translate the physical movements. So I don't know if you noticed that when the clock starts, the bass started sort of almost making the ticking noises of a clock, as well as integrating that with the pianist who was trying to create the more suspenseful emotional mood. So that, in itself is just fascinating that these musicians are not only listening to each other, but integrating the visual information as well as communicating with their peers. So quite a complex effect. And of course, you can imagine if, I can then hopefully generalize this to say that, if we were to have improvisers on the stage while the movie's being shown, that they're actually taking into account all of those features at the same time. And so this basically led me to ask, what if I present very specific emotions? So, because that one was kind of ambiguous, and I didn't really know if they would know where to take the emotion. And so I did this movie that I presented at a big arts festival last year called Moments. And here in this movie, basically, I looked at the 6 universal emotions, and I explored them in trying to understand a relationship between 2 characters. And the 6 universal emotions I looked at were happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. And they're called universal because there's a lot of evidence showing that those basic emotions, irrespective of where you come from in this world, we all share the same physiological manifestation of that emotion. So happy really is happy. The smile up, the almost squinched eyes, everyone has that. And also there's evidence that if you give certain the facial expressions of those emotions to newborn infants, they're able to replicate them with high accuracy. And they may not know what they mean, but they're surely able to replicate them. So that's evidence towards the fact that they're universal. And so I'm just going to show you just small clips of this. And same idea. I met with the musicians before the actual live performance, and I had them, here I did have them watch the movie because I actually wanted them to know the whole sequence because they're divided into 5 chapters. However, I said, and we talked about possibilities, but I said, all right, forget what we did, don't think about it, erase it. And then a month later we had the performance, so it was pretty much new. They really didn't remember what was going on. And I said, okay, improv the score live on stage, the 3 of you. And so it's quite amazing, really, the score they came up with. So this is just a mini idea of a section, and this is from the sadness chapter. part of the happiness chapter, and just what I want to point out with, because I'm also doing a similar scene analysis and a musical analysis, and what I'm discovering is that, as you notice in this one, you have that water falling. The pianist is literally mimicking the water. It has nothing to do with the emotion. That's been the contextual emotion that's happening in the scene, while the saxophone is continuing the theme he had actually started in where you actually see them laughing and playing with the water earlier. And in the sadness, what is also fascinating is that the musicians are literally mimicking the tempo of the movement of the woman's body. So literally, when she breathes, they're actually recreating that. So they're combining both. They're using musical variables like tempo, mode, major, minor sequences, and rhythm to exactly try to translate what's visually happening into a different language, which is music. And here's a scene from the sort of the Hitchcockian sort of suspense, and this is part of the fear scene. It was great. He literally mimicked that exact turn. Enters perfect. And the bass is actually mimicking the tempo of which she's moving. So again, it's amazing visual auditory coordination that's happening. So, once again, of course, when we hear that, it seems intuitive, but once you sit down and actually break apart the scenes, I'm basically using scientific methodologies on top of these more artistic, if maybe fun, if you will, explorations of emotion. And then, keeping these observations in mind, I then started to ask, okay, what happens now if we mix music and language together? Because in that movie, it was all about body language. They hardly speak. There's only about 6 lines in the entire 45 minutes of the film. And so I was like, okay, I'm going to do this in theater now. So I just recently premiered my latest Spanish language theatrical production called Última Partida, The Final Draw. And in here, the story is basically, it's the final one-act conversation between a woman and a man in a cabaret as they dissect apart their emotionally charged stories of love, desire, solitude, and death. And so when the public saw the play, I mean, they viewed it as a perfectly dramatical experience. And I had a pianist, the cabaret's pianist, as a character within the play, improvise the soundtrack live in the moment. Because I was really interested in trying to see whether there would be a relationship between not only the emotional translation of the music within the body language, but also within the language, and if that would affect the actor's tempo or not, in conjunction with the music. And I'm starting to analyze all of this, and indeed, amazing as well how the pianist is actually moving in time with the movement and the sound of the actors as much as the actors are in conjunction with the musician. And here's just and again, the color scheme is a bit funny. This should be all red. So just let's listen to this audio clip. It's in Spanish, so if you don't know Spanish, it's okay. So just really focus in listening to the music. And in this particular clip, this is the scene where the woman and the man are revisiting their intense physical past together by seducing each other now in the present. So just listen carefully to the music. Again, completely improvised in the moment. again, I've been analyzing this, and it's amazing that in this particular moment of seduction, if you will, the pianist decided to use a blues. And his tempo is actually going in the exact tempo in which their voices are, and their voices are changing in conjunction with his tempo. And so, just once again, as with the film examples, musical variables like tempo, sound level, rhythm, and major minor changes are interacting with language variables such as tempo and articulation and the modulation of sound. And again, because both are live, both are providing feedback, visual auditory feedback to each other in real time. Okay, so where does this leave us? Well, creativity is a structured integrative process. We're combining and recombining new sensory input with content from experience into new forms to reach a goal. The more experience, the more extravagant the outcome. So that's the reason why professionals are used in these experiments, because we're trying to emulate the highest possible level of creativity. And then also the more involved, so the more people you have involved in the creative process working together, the more complex the feedback is. And so yes, when you're looking at art form, because you're not controlling all these variables, you do have a lot of noise, but you can still sort of go and head into the unknown. So cognitive neuroscience can help us determine rather precise structural and functional relationships between anatomy and behavior. But again, because replication is fundamental, the process, this experience is reduced to core principles and universals. And yet art can help us widen our perspective precisely because novelty is expected. And so therefore it really ushers an experience into the unknown, and surprise variables start to appear. And so what I'm hoping with all of this is that once we put all this data together, hopefully I'll be able to unite the two disciplines, and that can lead us to a much better, more complete understanding of creativity in individuals and in society. As we say in the movies. Mm-hmm. Like who evaluates, who makes the judgment as to whether something is good or bad? That's a really interesting question, because yeah, I mean, how do you evaluate? How do you judge that something is good, or how do you judge that the person creating or improvising in the moment is really at their best? I don't think there is a way. I mean, unless you know that individual and you see them in multiple different contexts, you can compare and contrast. Okay, maybe you can sort of be like, oh, this was much better. I think really what matters a lot of the times is, well, if it moves you, so if it does the purpose of enhancing or creating positive emotional dissonance in you, the perceiver, and that you enjoy and you find that pleasurable, then it's good. Why is it bad? Sort of. If it's not connecting with you, I think that's generally when we make that judgment, that when we can't connect with the painting or the music or whatever it is, and when we feel distant from it, we feel like something's missing. So maybe that's the evaluative judgment we give to something that's bad. Yeah, I don't have a direct answer. I think it's something that is hidden there in terms of how we try to decide whether it's working or not working. Yeah. Uh-huh. There's a correlation between that?
or like the more you're able to shut down, even though it's considered, a mental health problem, right? But that in a way that it does bring about this artistic expression in them because their brain is set to shut down in those areas.
Yeah, interesting question. And I think one way to possibly look at it is, okay, so let's remember, what do we mean when it's shutting down? So we're shutting down awareness. We're letting go of moral judgment, social judgment. I mean, we're being ourselves in a way. So perhaps, especially if individuals have a problem with being in social norms, following social expectations, then in art, we allow people to be free, but we don't allow people to be free in other domains. So perhaps that's simply just saying, okay, well then precisely that's what art is about. I don't care what the guy next to me is thinking, as long as I'm expressing myself, as long as I feel comfortable, that's all that matters. So, it turns out actually that this deactivation occurs not just in the creative process, but in other meditation type exercises. That part of the brain is tuning off. So if you do yoga or other sort of meditation forms, you may realize that you are entering into the zone as well. I think also in certain dream states, you're entering into that state of complete disinhibition. And that's kind of something that Freud in his earlier work in interpretation of dreams, the beginning of the 1900s, that he precisely was saying, in dreams, that's when you're free. So that also his hypothesis about this letting go of all the stuff that's hitting us and all the little voices we're hearing of society is precisely that.